Welcome, Robin. It's great to have you again. I'll just do a quick intro for you. Robin Hanson is an American economist and author. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the George Mason University and a former research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. So thank you for joining us again, Robin. I'm very looking forward to another discussion on cultural drift. We've done one interview on the subject, and that was about a year ago.
I think you're going.
Live stream. Yeah, live stream's going, I think. Yeah, good. All right, no worries. Good, all right. All right, take two. Thanks, Robin. Good to see you again. I'll just
back. We're working.
touch on the introduction I gave beforehand. Cheers.
So shall I
I'll cede
start?
the floor to you. Yes.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Adam. Hello, everyone. I'm, I guess, a longtime futurist, and like Adam, but in the last year or so, I've become a bit more worried about the future. I hope that doesn't disqualify me from being a futurist, but I'm going to describe what I'm worried about here. And then I hope we'll have lots of Q&A, right? We've got people here and can discuss this. So I don't intend to talk for that long, but let's get started. All right, so out in biology, in the world, we have many different habitats that animals and plants live in, and these habitats vary in size. Some of these habitats are large, like big chunks of the ocean, and some of them are small, like rivers or coral reefs or tropical forests, where there are lots of little different habitats, and species tend to be fragmented into these little habitats. So in the places where the habitats are big, the species have many members, and there aren't as many of those species. Whereas in the habitats that are fragmented, therefore small, there are few members of each species, but a lot of different species. Now, it turns out that if you think about innovation, biological innovation, the bigger the species, the faster you would get of innovation within the species, of things that are allowed to vary within the species, because there's more different places for the innovation to appear, and then if they appear, they can spread to the entire rest of the species. It's harder to spread innovations across species boundaries. But if we think about innovation of species, so species, in order to exist as a separate species, they have to have some things in common that let them, say, mate with each other and form body plans that are compatible. And for evolution of those species defining features, what we need is more species. And so the fragmented section on the right, that's the one which has more species. And so it'll have more innovation of species, of the things that species have to have in common, and it will have less innovation of the things inside species. So there's a trade-off. Do you want more innovation within species or between species of the species? And it turns out, when we look at things on the Earth today and where they came from, more of them came from the fragmented kinds of environments than from the large integrated ones. And so apparently innovation of matters more than innovation in, perhaps surprisingly. And our DNA replication systems have features to promote this. That is, they have higher rates of errors and change in the mating system, what then allows more speciation, i.e. creating of new species, which then promotes more of this evolution of species than evolution in species. All right, so that's biology. Now, let's talk about culture, and then we'll get back to this idea of versus in. So culture is humanity's superpower. It's the thing that makes us different from all the other animals. And the key idea is described in the diagram up there on the upper right. Once upon a time, there was only asexual reproduction in life, and then life invented sex, and that was where it could get more than one parent and combine stuff from two parents, and that allowed a great increase in the rate of innovation in biology. And then humanity has pioneered cultural evolution, where we can inherit behaviors and patterns not just from our two immediate DNA parents, but from many others of the previous and the current generation. And that's what allows us to change our behavior so much faster than other animals. Now, the word culture has many connotations. In some definitions, it's just everything we do is culture, and then in some others that there are certain things that are more culture-y, maybe more prestigious or groupy or normie. And the world of discussion of culture, it turns out if you look around you, the most prestigious people in our society are the people who fight over which direction culture should go, but then there are the people who study culture as a process, and those people tend to have much less prestige. Now, this process of cultural evolution only works because we copy non-randomly. So if we just copied random behaviors of other members of our species, it wouldn't work. That wouldn't actually improve things. What has to happen is to copy the better than average behaviors or features of the rest of our species. And then we will do better, then we can learn and improve better than average. And probably the first cultural heuristic that we used to decide who was better than average was status or popularity. It's similar, but not quite the same. And once we got that sort of thing going, then we added learning through culture a lot of other ways to decide which things to copy. So for example, by now we understand that if you want to be the best fisher person, you shouldn't just copy the highest status person and how they fish. You should copy the person who is the best fisher. The people, whoever catches the most fish, copy how they fish. And we have by now collected a lot of heuristics like that to speed up cultural evolution about which things of which people to copy. And basically, most unique human features are probably the result of cultural evolution because cultural evolution is so much faster and powerful. Probably basically once we had the mechanism of cultural evolution, we could use that to evolve other things much. And therefore, most of the things we actually have that are uniquely human probably came from this process of cultural evolution. All right, so coming back to in versus of, we still have this distinction and it matters for culture. Now there's more than just two levels of culture, say, but there's still the concept, do we want evolution of the things that can vary most easily within cultures or of the cultures themselves, the things that define them and are hard to change within them. So things that are easy to vary within culture are things like technology, the arts, even professions, cities, business practices, etc. But then the things that are harder to vary within a culture, that more define a culture, tend to be norms and values, status markers. And if we have bad choice of these things, especially status markers, the evolutionary process of who we copy what can go wrong. And again, strikingly, most of the most prestigious talk in our world is often by people fighting over which direction culture should go. So to get a better handle on culture, I want to focus on corporate cultures because they're more visible. So culture tends to be something that's hard to see, hard to get a handle on. We sort of like swimming in the ocean. You don't, like a fish, you don't really notice it's there. But we can get more data and understand how corporate culture. So again, there are, say, industries with a few big firms or industries with a lot of little firms, and they will then vary in their nature of evolution. So, but let's start with the basics. Most firms die within about 5 years of when they're born. They don't last that long. And even our biggest firms, say on the S&P 500, they only last there for about 20 years before they're off the list. So corporations are being created and dying quite rapidly. On this list of our biggest corporations, if you look at the stock value of the companies, about 10% of their value is attributable to tangible things you can see, like machines and land and trucks, inventory, even patents. And the rest of that 90% of the value of firms is, in some sense, cultural. It's how they do things. And that's what's hard to copy by other firms. So what's unique and valuable in a firm is typically what it's hard to see and copy if you were just to try to make a substitute for that firm. And so firms know that culture is really important to them. It's their managers know that, and they worry correctly, in fact, that cultures will just go wrong, and they do go wrong. And in fact, that's what typically kills firms. Culture goes wrong. So culture evolves through process of cultural evolution. And sometimes it gets better and sometimes it gets worse. And usually over time, it gets worse. Now, managers want to stop this. And so the CEO has powerful incentives. They have big stock options, etc. And they have powers. They can order everybody what to do. And they are eager to make sure the culture doesn't decay and kill the firm. And so they often have large cultural change projects whereby they decide the direction they want corporate culture to go, and then they initiate and give orders and tell people what to do and inspire them with speeches, etc. And those sorts of cultural change efforts typically take about 5 years, and 2/3 of the time are said to fail. So it's just really hard not only to see culture, but to control it, even if you're the CEO of a firm and your whole profit and future depend on making sure your firm culture doesn't die. They still do. So then why do firms get better over time if each firms get worse? Well, the key point is selection. So when we make new firms, we don't have them copy random old firms. They copy the best old firms. And when their culture gets better, those things grow and get larger as opposed to shrinking and going away. But we still, even in firms, have this distinction between of and in. And in fact, industries with more smaller firms tend to have more innovation, just like with the species and the habitats. So again, innovation of is more important than innovation in. Okay, so now maybe we're ready to think about larger cultures, macro cultures. And what I just mean by a macro culture is the largest units we have that manage the largest ranges of behavior. So think of nations or even ethnicities. And if we think about these macro cultures, we can see some worrying trends over the last few centuries. So basically, think about you're driving a car, or driving something. Then in order for the driving process to work, there has to be a rate at which you get information about seeing the road ahead, and then you try to react to the road, and you have to calculate that, and you have to move your hands, and then there has to move the wheels, and then you have to have low noise in that and fast enough reaction so that you don't go off the road. If you're going fast enough down the road and the road's moving more fast and your wheel is sloppy, then you will just go off the road and crash. So similarly, cultural evolution and all evolution needs the rates to be good enough. That is, it needs a large enough variety of cultures which are, having strong enough selection pressures, so when and slow enough environmental change so that the natural selection can track as the environment changes. It's got enough selection pressure, enough variation compared to its internal random changes so that the process can track the environment and stay on the road. But in the last few centuries, if we think about our macro cultures, we've had 4 different ways in which things are getting worse. So first of all, the environment's just changing a lot faster than it did centuries ago. So the economy doubles roughly every 15 to 20 years. And major elements of society change on that time scale in order to let the economy double that fast. A few centuries ago, the world had basically hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures. And then we basically crammed those peasant cultures forcefully into national cultures a century or so ago. And that was a great reduction in their variety. Each peasant culture typically had its own different styles and language and habits and, holidays even. And then we made national cultures out of that, which then, had many advantages, larger markets, etc. But it greatly reduced the variety that was there before. And then in the last century, we've crammed many different national cultures into a world culture, at least of elites. Elites are especially sharing a world monoculture in our world. And so a great reduction in variety. And then in place of these very poor peasant cultures that then in the past were suffered to a lot of famine and disease and war, we are now rich and comfortable, peaceful, healthy. And so cultures just don't die remotely as often as they used to. And finally, in addition, in the past, these peasant cultures were pretty conservative. They didn't want to make changes, and they made changes only as fast as they were forced to. But today we've got a lot of people who are eager to create cultural change. And in fact, we have fashion that we reward people for changing, and cultural activists who cause cultural change have become our largest cultural heroes. And so we have a lot of change that's caused by these sort of activities that isn't plausibly tracking what we would call biologically adaptive. So from the point of view of this natural selection process of culture, it's somewhat random and therefore plausibly contributing to this difficulty of the evolutionary process tracking the world. So, and by comparison with corporate cultures, our leaders of these macro cultures have even less power over the culture and weaker incentives. So you can't really be counting on them to do a lot of cultural change initiatives, which they don't. And at the macro cultural level, then, this prediction is that we're going to have, because we now have a lot fewer bigger cultures, we're going to have better evolution within them. And we do. We have record rates of technological innovation and innovation in business practices. But the prediction would also be that we're going to have worse evolution of cultures, because we have very few of them, weak selection pressures. And that's bad. That may not, cause its bad consequences immediately, but the prediction here is we have less evolution of macrocultures, of the features they share across the whole culture that are hard to vary within them. And therefore that we're going to be drifting away from the road. We were once adaptive in the middle of some sort of adaptive road, and because of this increased randomness and difficulty of driving, we're drifting off the road. And there's two ways that this drift can happen. One is just a random walk. We were once in a good place and we randomly move away. But another way that drift can happen is the idea that basically cultural evolution in the past took us away from what was once a human nature. There was like a deep human nature long ago, but then the environment changed, and so cultural evolution moved us away from what was a basic human nature, but it had to exert a pressure to do so. And once that pressure is released, we just drift back toward a more natural human nature, which may not at all be adaptive in our current world. So plausibly, for example, decadence, people often describe maybe a natural human nature as lazy, present-oriented, selfish, and that without cultural pressures to do otherwise, that's where we drift back to. And that can be described as a kind of decadence, which has often been a complaint about civilizations as they rose and fell in the past. And in addition, I think we can plausibly say that once upon a time we were naturally foragers, and then cultural pressure had to be exerted to turn us into farmers. Farmers are really quite different than foragers in many ways. And then in the last centuries, as we have gotten rich and comfortable, the pressures that made us into farmers have weakened, and we are drifting back into forager ways, which can plausibly explain trends toward lower religion, more promiscuity, more travel, more leisure, more democracy, less fertility. A bunch of trends plausibly can be understood as drifting back to forager styles. All right, so if we have this drift problem of cultural drift, it would show itself up in long-term cultural trends that were maladaptive. Now, we can identify many long-term cultural trends, but it's harder to decide which of those we think are maladaptive, i.e. not promoting the long-term success of the species in terms of not dying and growing. So I've listed some candidates on this slide of various kinds of trends that might be maladaptive. And we could discuss any one of those, but I'm going to focus on one which I think is the most plausibly diagnostic of the problem, which is fertility. So basically we have plausibly a fertility problem of fertility falling and getting too low, below replacement. Perhaps plausibly even now the whole world is below replacement on net. And if we look at the causes of falling fertility, it seems to be a number of cultural trends that are adding up to this lower fertility. So I've listed some of them here. Given other things, gender equality seems to have caused lower fertility. We have norms for more intensive parenting, that people are supposed to spend a lot more time with their kids than they did in the past, which also makes it seem more harder to have kids since they're so demanding now. We have these long and flexible school and career paths, and people who are ambitious and successful don't, especially women, want to continue on those paths and not give up on themselves until they can see how far they can go, but that leaves less time after those paths are more open to then have kids before biological deadlines appear. When I was young and got married, marriage was more of a cornerstone process where we got married at the beginning of life when we were not very well formed and didn't know exactly who we were going to be and whether we were going to succeed. And now there's more the norm that marriage is a capstone. First, you get your act together and you get your career set and you figure out what you want, and then you go find someone who's compatible with that. But by the time you've done that, you've again lost a lot of the time that you might have had kids. And in addition, we've got, compared to ancient societies, our grandparents are just much less involved in children's lives. They don't pay for it. They don't, babysit as much. They aren't living with them, etc. And that's also, making it harder to have kids. And finally, there's a bunch of other trends, like we're more urban or less religious, more integrated world. All of these trends seem to be contributing toward fertility decline. Basically, sometime, say 2050, 2060, plausibly, world population will peak. We already had seen the peak of the number of babies born every year. That was in 2016, and now that's on a decline. And basically, after the peak, slowly over centuries, world population will decline. And that might reach extinction if it went on for 2,000 years, but it probably won't. But what you might not realize will happen in this period is that innovation will slow down dramatically. So just to give you a brief overview of the idea, basically our standard simplest model of innovation is that innovation is proportional to economic activity. So the bigger our economy is, the more innovation we do. And in an exponentially growing economy, as we've seen in the past, the amount of innovation we've had in the last year is then a substantial fraction of all the innovation we've seen so far. And so we see this perception of growth. That's what allows the economy to continue to grow exponentially, is the fact that each year you have an amount of innovation that's, adding a substantial percentage to everything we've ever had so far to the whole stock. Because basically you're using all the innovations we've ever found to do everything we do. Now, in an exponentially declining economy, as in the lower part of this graph, the amount of activity in the most recent period is a much, much smaller fraction than all the activity so far. And that means you will see very little innovation. That is, you will add very little to the stock of all the innovation you have so far. So basically, as population declines from the peak, innovation will grind to a halt. We will not have new stuff, basically. And that, once we don't stop having new stuff, that can just go on for centuries until population, the economy revives back to the level that it had been at before the decline. And if you ask, how many more years worth of innovation do we have in this sort of up versus down period compared to what we'd have in a continuing exponential period? Like, what would be the equivalent continuing exponential period? That's, I've guessed, to be roughly 60 to 90 years worth of more technical progress. So whatever you're hoping to happen needs to happen by then, or it may be many centuries before it happens again. So now, if we just focus on fertility, we're going to get back to culture in a moment, but if we just focus on fertility and tried to look for fixes to fertility, well, the most obvious fix is that there's already a fix going on, which is that there are a small number of insular fertile, highly religious subgroups like the Amish and Haredim, and they are in fact doubling every 20 years and have been for a while. And that's roughly what the Christians did to take over the Roman Empire. They did that for doubling every 20 years for 300 years, and then they dominated. And so if these groups continue to grow at that rate, even if some parts of them fail at that, other parts continue to grow because they're very decentralized, then they will replace our dominant world civilization, and world population will grow again, and then they may find a new high civilization, etc. Now, of course, the thing you may not like about that scenario is that they will probably throw away many things we cherish because they're very insular. That's the whole point. They're resisting and suspicious of the larger culture, which is why they're able to defy the larger culture and not integrate it with it and sustain a different practice. So what other fixes are available? Well, some people hope that DNA evolution will kick in, that the people who have more kids will have kids whose DNA makes them inclined to have more kids. That didn't happen in the rise and fall of the Greek and Roman Empire, which also seemed to have been driven in large part by population declines due to fertility declines. And so I'm skeptical about that, but that could happen. Obviously, we might get human level AI in this next period, and then we'll talk a bit about what that does but that at least revives the economy, so the economy starts having innovation again. It would probably work if most 20-year-olds today would just freeze their eggs and sperm and then start raising kids when they're 35 or older, when they finally feel like they're ready to. Although it's actually a lot of work to have kids, and so I'm not so sure how many people was actually going to want to raise kids when they're 35 or so. But that, if they would, that would work. And another approach that I think would work if we were willing to adopt it is basically to pay parents to have kids. Now, the simplest free market solution would be to let parents own their kids, endow their kids, say, with debt that the kids had to pay them back with, which then the parents could sell in order to raise their kids. Most people hate that idea. It's just a terrible thing to do to your kids, to endow them with debt. But they don't seem to mind the fact that the government already now endows every new kid with their share of the national debt. That's just our current practice. And actually, estimates in the United States, the debt per person is roughly, it's $100,000 per person according to like the official debt. But when you look at unfunded liabilities, it's $400,000 to $700,000 a person. So we could basically give parents a cut of that, and there's a better way to do it. And then I think that's plenty enough to get parents to start having more kids if you offer them that amount of money per kid. And basically that the government could do that as a win-win deal, because every kid is going to pay off their fraction of the national debt. So paying kids to exist then is a way to pay off the debt, and it's a financially win-win deal. But in order to make this happen, you'd have to change our culture enough to want to do this. I'm not so sure we will. Anyway, but even if we fix fertility, which I hope we do, a key thing to notice is that doesn't necessarily fix this cultural drift problem. That is, cultural drift is plausibly the cause of the fertility decline, but we can often fix problems without necessarily fixing their cause. Do something else instead to make the problem less, and we could do that with fertility, but if we don't fix cultural drift, then we run the risk that cultural drift will make us decay in other ways and maybe make fertility decline again in the future. So that makes us turn our attention to what could we do to fix cultural drift. All right, so I have 3 categories of kinds of ways we could think about the problem being fixed over perhaps centuries. The first category is, I told you that the cultural drift problem was we had these parameters of the cultural evolution process, and once upon a time those parameters have been pretty good, and then the parameters went bad. And so one category of fixes is to change those parameters again, make the parameters go back to being good. Now, probably, in a sense, the worst way to fix cultural drift would be just to return back to famine, poverty, war, pestilence, which centuries ago was in fact producing a world of healthy cultural evolution, but not such great lives. That would be the chaotic solution here. Perhaps, as I was just mentioning, if we could get fertility going along, that increases some degree of selection pressures, because differential fertility is a selection pressure that's going on now. Whether that would be enough, it's less clear, but at least it would be a step in the right direction. If we invent human-level AI, it turns out that AI is naturally Malthusian in the sense that because it's so easy to grow the population of AI compared to the economy, that the population would continually rise faster than the economy could grow until the point of subsistence, basically, wages, which then means a world of AIs or brain emulations, because I have this book, The Age of M, is a world of Malthusian workers who are working near subsistence wages, and that's a world of stronger selection pressures, which might be enough to fix cultural drift, though many people who are concerned about AI safety are concerned to make sure that AIs do not have a separate culture from us that evolves autonomously from us, but it stays firmly under our control, in which case that doesn't fix cultural drift. If humans' culture is drifting and you slave AI culture to human culture, then AI culture does not fix cultural drift of human culture. Finally, eventually, when we spread across the stars, the long lags of communication will fragment culture across the stars, which would then guarantee a lot of cultural variation. But I still think that at any one star, if you only have one monoculture at that star, that's not going to go very well. I think you want enough cultural variation within a star system for cultural evolution to work. And it's not enough in the short run, at least, to have many different star systems. So that's the first category of fixes, which is somehow the process parameters get fixed so that we have healthier cultural evolution process. Now, two other categories of fixes here can be more thought of as the end of culture, as basically saying, let's not use this cultural evolution process anymore as our main process, which is a pretty daunting thing to do because this has been humanity's superpower for 1 million years at least. So setting aside our superpower for some other substitute is a pretty dramatic and perhaps desperate move, but that may be what we need to consider. So one way to have an end of culture is to basically just change the content of culture to be adaptive and then have the culture not want to change itself. That is, if we all, and many people really like this idea of a deliberate replacement for culture. That is, let's just sit down and talk about what we want our norms and values to be and what would be good norms and values to have. And then once we agree on that, let's just agree not to change it, agree that it's a good thing and we like it the way it is. And then if the community that does this is only a small part of the world or not the entire world, then it also needs to create an insularity that blocks off influence from the rest of the world that would cause it to drift, say much like the Amish. And then there are some versions of what that culture could be. So we all deliberately decide, no, we want this to be our culture, and then we're going to make it this way deliberately, and then we're not going to let it change. And that probably involves not really celebrating cultural activists so much anymore either. One version could be a multicultural version where we, instead of our current shallow multiculturalism, we actually had different groups who had deeply different values, and we liked that, and then we had these different groups maybe do enough trading so they didn't have to be poor, but maybe culturally insulated from each other, and then we'd have more variety for cultural evolution. Another scenario would be we pick a time in the past when we thought culture was adaptive, and we return to it in some sort of grand conservative heaven. We take some past culture and we return to it, but unfortunately, past culture was often mixed up with the local context of the time, so in some sense you'd have to generalize that culture from its context so that it was applicable and sensibly to the world we live in today, which seems like a big ask. We could more directly just reason about a different set of culture we want to depict that happened to be adaptive, or we could perhaps just pick adaptation as our value, and then whatever norms and values we could calculate would promote adaptation, we could have that be our norms and values. This again seems like a pretty big ask from most people's point of view. That's not the kind of things they see as valuable, but that's a possibility. The final category of solutions here is to have an effort to change culture, recruit government and law in its service. And this has often been what's happened when people had cultural activist movements. So in the past, when people wanted to change, sexism or racism or whatever, they didn't just promote those changes culturally. They often promoted government to take their side and enforce more their new cultural values. And that's available here for any of these cultural change scenarios. But if we think about going to the extreme of this, one scenario that I think does work is what I'd call full capitalism. So today we have capitalism, but we limit it in some ways. That is, it doesn't control parenting and childhood. It doesn't run governments. And it doesn't actually control the future in the sense that we've limited the ability of organizations like firms to just reinvest all their assets and grow to dominate the economy. That's because we have certain rules about bequests and wills that, if they had been different, would have created actually large capitalist organizations that were focused on the long run, and then would have pushed interest rates down to very low levels that would then make them have a reason to invest in the long-term future. But so if we went wild and let capitalists do all these things, which we aren't now, if we let them just reinvest their money into becoming huge capitalist firms. We let them buy and run governments. We let them pay parents and sell off the kids. Then capitalism has enough competition and variation to, in fact, be an effective substitute for cultural evolution. It's just a lot of people just don't want full capitalism. They just don't like that idea. A version that might not really work very well, but it's at least a similar concept of what if we just had people who ran nations who had long-term interest in those nations, they not necessarily capitalists, but who ran the country and weren't so accountable to the voters, but then really just cared about the long-term, of that nation, and then they might promote fertility and other sorts of things by which culture would no longer drift. People really like democracy, so that seems like a big ask as well. And finally, my last suggestion here, this is the last thing I'll say before I open this up to discussion and questions, is that I am the inventor of a different form of governance called futarchy. Its main feature is that you agree on a metric, an outcome that you want, and then betting markets are used to figure out which policies would actually achieve those outcomes. And arguably, it would be very effective at actually figuring out which policies would achieve whatever ends you want. That by itself isn't enough to overcome cultural drift. You'd have to combine that with a polity, a governance community that was willing to set the goal of this futarchy to be a long-term goal that they were willing to hold on to and not change. And you'd need that goal to not just be long-term, but to be inconsistent with civilization decline and cultural drift. So, for example, I've done polls. We could say, when do 1 million people live in space? Or when do we finally get to the stars? Or when do we achieve immortality? Those sorts of goals would be difficult goals, so they would take several centuries to achieve. And then futarchy would say, well, in order to achieve that, we need to prevent civilization decline and drift. And so it would calculate and do whatever it took to prevent that in order to make sure that we could achieve these long-term goals. And we couldn't just have preventing collapse be the long-term goal, because that isn't really very motivating to people. So the goals I just described, I think, could be described as sacred goals. People would be willing to see them as grand, inspiring goals. And then the key point is that when the futarchy government, enacts policies in order to achieve these long-term goals, some of those policies are going to feel at the moment like impositions, like constraints, like you don't like them. And then when you see that they are in the service of these long-term goals that you approve of, you're willing to accept the short-term sacrifice and even be proud of it, because people are often proud to sacrifice in the short term for a long-term sacred goal that they really embrace. All right, so that's my list of potential mechanisms. I think the highest thing to notice here is that none of these seem especially likely or attractive scenarios. Some of them that seem more attractive don't seem very likely. Some of them that seem likely don't seem very attractive. And so we're just facing this deep problem that I'm here to tell you about. Not good news, sorry. We are facing cultural drift as a problem of humanity. And so the key summary here, I'm trying to figure out how to end this.
Can you just give them an elevator pitch? If you were to have to describe this in 1 or 2 minutes to somebody, the board of the CEO of the world, how would you tell them while you're in
Humanity is spectacular compared to all the other animals because we have this superpower, culture. And it's been going for 1 million years and making us do great. And then in the last few centuries, we kind of broke it. Now, we didn't break it at the lowest level of technology and business practices, because that's things that can vary easily within a culture. But if you look at cultures as units and the things that are harder to vary within a culture, we broke the process of evolution of that because we have vastly less variety, vastly weaker selection pressures because we're rich and comfortable and peaceful and healthy. And we have much higher rates of internal drift and change, much higher rates of the environment changing, all of which adds up to plausibly we are just not able to drive this car. The cultural evolution process that's supposed to track the changing road fast enough to not go off the road is failing. We are going off the road. That's what cultural drift is. And then we face the question, how do we fix cultural drift? Because the most straightforward prediction of failing to fix this is that civilization declines and falls to be replaced by some new civilization, which then may rise again and suffer this problem again, because there's a basic problem of civilization, really. Civilizations are large units that share culture across large scales and that are rich and comfortable and that have often eager to change their culture internally, cultural activists, and fast-changing environment, and that's all a recipe for failure. So that's my quick summary of the problem of cultural drift. And then at the end, I went through 3 different categories of solutions, and as I said, none of them seem especially either attractive or likely.
And do you want to just clarify what you mean by between variance in cultures and then versus the of variance?
Right, so in biology, there's species, and species have evolution within species, and that works better when you have a few big species, because then each innovation in a species can spread to the whole species. And you also have evolution of species, of the things that each species, all the members have to have in common. For evolution of species, what you need is a lot of little species, like happens in rainforests or rivers or coral reefs. And that level actually matters more than the evolution in species. And therefore, overall, we get more evolution from fragmented habitats in biology. And the same seems to be true in culture. It's true for firms and doing cultural evolution of corporate cultures, and seems to be true at macro levels. So what we've done is merged all these little cultures into one big world macroculture, which does great for evolution within the macroculture, but it's bad for evolution of the macroculture.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me an example of macrocultural evolution you think is going really bad, like right now?
For fertility is one. That is,
Yeah.
I gave a list of proximate cultural trends that seem to be causing fertility decline. But then I have a long list I gave on a slide of other potential trends that could be understood. That's less clear which are maladaptive trends, but say increasing drug deaths, increasing mental illness, increasing spending on medicine, increasing spending on education even. There's a lot of trends that are not so, laudable
As a result
and
of
plausibly could be contributing.
yeah, it's a slowdown of innovation was probably more like focusing on
That, and that might be
slowdown.
overregulation. Overregulation is plausibly another sort of cultural drift problem. Legal complexity. These are all long-term trends that plausibly not adaptive, but are still, either the result of random changes or a reversion, as I said, to decadence or forager styles.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things that comes to my mind, I'm trying to see if there's any questions in the audience, please. Yeah, so you seem to be less bullish on the future of artificial intelligence than a lot of other people at the moment, especially when it comes to innovation, right?
Well,
You don't
there's
think
two
AI can
there's
help
two
with
parts
it?
of AI, right? One is when will it happen? Like how fast will AI get how good, and then how much of the economy will displace how fast. So I am somewhat less optimistic than I guess the most extreme rah-rah fans at the moment. I mean, obviously most of the world today, even most technologists are not super into AI, but there is a community of people super into AI, especially the companies selling them, and the company, VCs really trying to get into it. Those people are making wild predictions of the form, the economy gets radically restructured within the next 10 years and everything's different. I think that's a little optimistic, but I'm on record of saying that eventually AI will appear and it will be a big deal. But what I'm more worried about here is that AI doesn't by itself fix this problem. That's the key thing. So most of you think of AI as just like an autonomous mind, but you don't realize you're making that analogy to a human mind, which is embedded in a culture, and the culture of human minds matters a lot to the evolution of humans. Similarly, the culture that an AI is in will matter a lot to the evolution of the AIs. So if we slave the AIs to human culture, and then human culture is drifting into maladaptation, then we're not really protecting the AIs from that fate as well. So in order for AIs to be an optimistic solution to cultural drift, we need them to be freed from human cultural drift, to face actually their Malthusian incentives and respond to that with cultural innovation. If they do that, then that would be a solution. And so I'm not, I think AI will take longer than the most extreme, hypers say, but I do think AI is coming, say, in the next century. I do worry, though, that it won't come fast enough
AI,
for the deadline. Well,
right.
the main thing I care about...
capable of innovating?
Right. Well, the main thing that matters, I think, is AIs that can substitute for humans in the economy. So AIs that can substitute and do our jobs would, in fact, be able to innovate. It's hard. You can't actually do jobs without innovating as a side effect of doing your job. So AIs that could do our jobs would, in fact, be able to innovate. But the question is, could we have AIs that are good enough to do most human jobs before this deadline, I said, of roughly 70 years? So
right.
We have exciting AIs now, and they're definitely doing things they couldn't in the past, but it's not clear they're at the point where they can take most human jobs. And so maybe they will be in 10 years or 20 or 30, but maybe they won't. Like, I've been around AI for a long time, and I've definitely heard for a long time how some set of people were so excited by the then current AI, they thought AI was about to displace humans en masse very soon then. And this was true 50 years ago. It was actually true 100 years ago. It's been true roughly every 30 years. There's been these bursts of interest and excitement and fear for automation and AI. And we're now in another one of those bursts for good reason. But you don't have to believe my forecast about the timing for the purpose of cultural drift. The main thing here you should notice is that AI could revive the economy and make sure innovation continues, but that doesn't solve cultural drift. We have a more fundamental problem. We've been relying on the superpower of culture, and we haven't even noticed it. We don't really see it. And so we don't realize how vulnerable we are to a system breaking. So we have many systems in our world. You've got systems of water and energy and systems for disease and all sorts of things. And if any one of the systems you rely on breaks, that could be a problem for you. So that's why you have specialists out there for each of these systems, tracking it and trying to make sure it doesn't break and being ready to fix it if it does. But we have nobody like that for culture because people don't realize it's a system we're relying on. And they don't realize that we're breaking it. And there's not some team or agency out whose job it is to go out there and fix that because we hardly even understand it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. All right. So who are the closest to well, first of all, AI. I think AI doesn't have to be fully human level or replace humans to help with innovation. It can still be sort of a partial tool that people can use to increase their capability to innovate. And so in the sense that AI can still, it's not like one big step change that suddenly AI is going to help innovate once it reaches human level. But there's a gradation as the tools become more and more useful and more, I guess, innovation friendly, then it can help humans do that. And arguably,
well,
it has.
I mean, there's two parameters here of interest. Like, one is the ability of AI to just do our jobs, and the other is the ability of AI to innovate. Now, I think the scenario you're describing is, what if AI is just much better relative to humans at innovating rather than doing our jobs?
No, I'm describing I guess the gradient between just an inert tool like a hammer and something can help augment our cognitive function. Right. So that's the driver of innovation, right?
If the AI can just do our jobs for us, then that will be enough to solve the innovation problem. We don't need them to be extra good at innovating. That is, it's just enough if they take over jobs, because merely doing the jobs well in a large economy would cause enough innovation for the economy to keep growing. That's not a problem.
Side effect.
The problem is, yes, it's even just a side effect. They don't need to try extra hard, right? If you're going to say, no, the human, AI can't do the human jobs, but it could do the innovating, now we need to imagine an AI who's extra good at innovating compared to doing jobs. And that's more of a challenge because, the AIs we see now, they're hardly able to do jobs, so they don't seem to be especially good at innovating. And I don't know why they would be, but I could see how they could just get good at doing jobs. And that would be enough to keep the economy large and growing. And large and growing economy is enough to keep it innovating.
Right, yes, so we're still talking about replacement here. I'm talking about augmentation.
Well, augmentation is like still in terms of doing jobs, right? That is, if the number of people is shrinking and then you augment them, and the effect of augmentation is as if there were as many people as before or more, okay, now you are growing the economy. The key thing is, are you growing the economy or not?
Yeah, sure, I get it. Okay, so I'm asking for questions in the audience. I think there's a lot to that, Robin. There's a lot to this talk. Look,
I
think
agree.
that,
It's
like,
new
I
to people,
really
but
should
hey,
have
you're
set
not
out
bored.
reading.
This isn't
Yeah,
something
not
you've all
bored.
heard before, so like this is new. So
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you spoke about children paying back their parents like until they've paid enough, and then they get released from their parental contract, and they can go out after that period of time and then do what they want. But you're saying that in a sense people do that with the government. They get HEX
right.
loans. I don't know, it's HEX in Australia,
Well,
what's in America. They owe the government a certain amount of money by going to university, getting loans and all that
I
sort of
mean
stuff. Or
that's just more directly. The government borrows money, and every citizen owes that money. That is, there's no extra
oh yeah, right.
loan contract. Basically, when the government borrows more money and then there's a new kid born, we just assign that kid their fraction of the debt because we make everybody pay
Okay.
the debt through taxes. And it doesn't matter whether the debt was acquired before you were born. Everybody just has to pay their taxes in order to pay off the debt, regardless of when the debt came in. So that means everybody is basically assigned their fraction of the national debt when they're born. That's what just our standard practice. It's not an extra piece of paper anybody sends you. There's no document you sign or anything. But just every year, the government taxes in order to cover its debt. And you're a citizen, so you get taxed. And that's how you are basically indebted.
So I mean,
And that doesn't bother anybody. If it would bother people,
would you prefer that we go back to paying our parents until?
I mean, as an economics thing, the parental choice would be more flexible. Government is, going to be a one size fits all thing, and it's not going to be so, well fine tuned, et cetera. But people seem to be more okay with the government endowing citizens with debt than they do parents endowing children with debt. So, if that's the limiting factor, then you have to go that way.
What about globalization? Where do you think that's going to take the world?
Well,
Is this a good
globalization
thing?
in culture is the world monoculture that's one of the main causes of this problem. That is, if we in fact had true deep multiculturalism, dozens or hundreds of different cultures in the world with really different values, we wouldn't be having this problem. At least some of them would be winning and growing, and the others would decline, but we would still have a overall growth in the world. The problem is we've all merged into this global monoculture, especially among elites, and that greatly reduces the variety. And then that process drifts according to cultural activism, and that's the key problem from drift.
Do you think that natural selection pressures will correct cultural drift over a
Well,
long period of
cultural
time, I guess?
drift
But do you
just
think it
is
will?
natural. It's just not DNA based. So DNA selection, as I said, some people think DNA selection will select for fertility, but for a million years, DNA selection has been selecting us for being vulnerable to and engaging in cultural as a process. That is,
So I didn't mean to imply it was going to be through DNA. I did mean cultural selection. Yeah.
right. Well, so again, in
Do you
order
think
for
there's a
culture to
natural
fix
force out
itself,
there that will select? Yeah. Will it fix itself in
well,
time for
right,
stuff to go right?
the strongest selection pressure we see at the moment is fertility. And so the Amish and the Haredim, et cetera, will in fact, over the next few centuries, win out by selection if nothing else happens. That's the threat. The question is, can you do better than that? So I don't think we're going to go extinct. I think, if we don't do something else, that's what will happen. But they will then throw away many things we value about our culture on purpose. And then in addition, the collapse in between will mean many things will be automatically thrown away. So the Roman Empire lost many things by its fall. And then the Christians who took over also threw away some things they didn't like. And that's the scenario of the Amish or Redham taking over our world. If you wanted to influence the future of world, then you need to influence them if they're the future. And
Oh, I
that's
kind of
if you,
find it ironic that, if the superpower is cultural selection that leads to innovation, then you're saying that the Amish are going to out innovate the rest of the world.
well, they're just
I
going
mean,
to
they're not well
outgrow the
known for
world.
their innovation.
Well, no, but see, the point is, we're about to face a period where innovation grinds to a halt. As population declines, the economy declines, innovation will stop. So their being less innovative will not be a penalty for them in this period where almost there isn't much innovation. And in that period, they will grow faster than everybody else, and then they will come to dominate. And then later on, if they grow big enough, innovation will start again, and then they'll have to figure out how they want to deal with that. But innovation only continues if our population growth continues.
Well, okay. Under this metaphysical assumption, that's how the things work, yes. But if we had perfect foresight, if you put your crystal ball on, what was the optimum level of cultural drift or the optimum configuration of it? And should we be aiming for a higher or a more lower rate? I guess you're suggesting.
Well, so I was saying the fixes in three categories. One category of fix is we change the parameters to be good again. And another fix is we change the content of culture. We just all agree together that we want our norms and values to be this, and we don't let cultural evolution change it anymore. We just say, nope, we're in charge, and we deliberately choose it to be this. And that would be a way of ending culture in a sense, saying, nope, we're not going to use, at least for our larger norms and values of our shared, world culture, we're not going to use cultural evolution for that anymore. And the third category of solutions is we get governance in to run the process of finding a fix one way or the other.
Now we're talking about values and norms. That's, the culture selects for values and norms. Ethics tries to discover what values or norms are the good ones to have. You don't trust the ethicists to come out with the good ones?
The world we're in is the world that's the result of all the different cultural influences on our values and norms. Some of that influence has been ethicists, but it's been actually pretty weak. Those have not been our primary influence on our values and norms. We could imagine what would happen if we did allow them to have more influence or gave them more deference. That might be another scenario of a more deliberate culture. But again, we are the world that results from the existing cultural evolution process that we've had. And that evolution process is actually pretty decentralized in the sense that we have a lot of different cultural entrepreneurs who try and influence culture and move it in different directions. And so people who write music or movies and professors who give lectures and even events like Future Day, in some sense, they're all different bids for cultural influence. And in some sense, I think you, Adam, probably consciously see yourself as trying to change culture to be more future friendly. And that's a thing many people do with their lives. They try to do something with their life to change the direction of culture. So the cultural evolution process that we have at the moment is the net result of people like you doing what you're doing. And you can see what basically happens is lots of people get it in their heads to do different things, but then there's this overall evolution process that picks out what happens as a total effect of everybody's. And that's the process I'm looking at and standing back and saying, how does that whole process work? And I'm saying that whole process is going wrong. So you trying harder on Future Day doesn't fix the whole process, right? Because you're just one part of this process. The question is how to fix the process.
Oh, well, I'm going to have to make a future century then. Maybe that'll be enough time. Yeah. And it'll be just one long conference.
If you thought that would work, but the point is we can analyze which different things might have what effects here. So we understand enough about the nature of cultural evolution to sit down and think here about what our options are and to think through what consequences those different choices might have. And again, my summary is we don't actually have a good idea.
If cultural drift is a driver of innovation, Can't we look at the actual driver and trying to surgically understand what causes good innovation and make sense of what kind of innovation is actually good, rather than rely on cultural selection pressures?
So again, I'm asking you to think in terms of these two levels, analogous to species and in species, right? So most
Yep.
of the innovation you think about is, technology and business practices, maybe how to organize your house, how to make a movie. Those are things that are easy to vary individually. Each of us can do those different for the most part. And that's the thing that goes great when we have one big world monoculture, because that's the evolution in, that's the innovation in. And so just like when you have one big species that has better innovation within that species, when we have one big world monoculture, we're doing great on that kind of innovation. But what you might not notice is there's another kind of innovation that's even more important. And that's the
Hmm.
innovation of the things we share as cultures, that it's hard to vary within a culture, like our norms and values, like the parameters that are driving fertility. So for example, the fact that we all get a lot of education, it's hard for you to deviate from that. You can choose to get less education, but then you will suffer the fact that other people won't respect you as much, which is why you tend to go to get a lot of education. That's why you're stuck in this world of shared expectations about everybody should get a lot of education. And that's a thing that's hard to vary individually. And that thing can change, that thing can evolve, and we need evolution of that kind of thing. How much education we expect people to get. And the question is, how do we get enough evolution of that? Hundreds of years ago, we had 100,000 cultures in the world, little peasant. And so they could each just vary independently and selection would take care of it. But now with one big world monoculture, that doesn't work.
Okay, so you think the world is monoculture, like there is only one culture in the whole world? What do you mean? That sounds wrong.
Well, certainly a lot less than there was, a lot less than 3 centuries ago, right?
Okay.
3 centuries
Oh,
ago, we
yeah,
had
sure.
hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures around the world. Whether it's one or five cultures in the world, however you want to count it, it's vastly less than it used to be. And so it's plausibly too little. But if you look at, say, the correlation of fertility decline around the world, it suggests there's a lot more common culture than you might have thought. There's just
In the
nowhere
space
where
of all
fertility is
possible
rising.
cultures that are compatible with the modern world, do you think we're missing key ones? What would another culture that would be able to keep up, I guess, economically with all the rest of the cultures, the macro cultures around at the moment? What kind of culture do you think we were missing?
Well, one way to see the lack of things is to see when people dislike deep multiculturalism. So many people like this idea of multiculturalism, but what they like is actually shallow things: songs, holidays, clothes, myths, food, people love the idea of having a world with lots of variety of those things. But if you start to say, what about variety in, say, gender equality? What about variety in military, aggressiveness? I mean, people say, no, they don't want any variety in that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
But you see, if you have a shared world culture where we say, no, we love gender equality, we hate military aggressiveness, and we're going to punish anybody in the world who deviates, now you see we don't have that much variety. So think about COVID. The whole world basically had pretty much the same COVID strategy. And those who tried to deviate were substantially shamed or pressured. Think about nuclear energy regulation. Almost nobody in the world defies the convention of everybody else about how to regulate nuclear energy. There are many areas of like that. It's like there's only one country in the world that allows organ sales. It happens to be Iran, and they get a lot of pressure and shaming from their deviation on that. Basically, think about those sorts of things and say, could we make a world that allowed and even celebrated that kind of variation? Yay, it's great that Iran does organ sales. Let somebody try that. It's great if North Korea does nuclear power regulation differently. Let's see that. What if Sweden does COVID regulation differently? Great, let's see that. You need a world where people were actually eager and accepting of variation, not just in surface practices, but in deep values.
Yeah, I guess people are concerned about human rights, like that as a as a product of organ sales, it could incent sort of violating people's rights to their own organs. But
Right. The
look,
more
people
opinions
from
we
the
have about human rights, the more of a monoculture we have. That's what monoculture is made of, is these strong moral opinions around the world about what the right practices are and what everybody should do, that anybody who deviates is a terrible person who should be pressured to stop. That's what culture is made out of.
well, there's been a few comments from
Great.
the audience. Like we're talking about, like if children are in debt, what if they end up disabled or mentally ill? What do we do? That's Jeremy's question.
So at the moment, the government just endows everybody with their share of the national debt. What that means is, we have means testing for taxes. That is, if you have lower income, then you pay less taxes, right? So already you're in this world already. This isn't a new world. The change would be that we might pay parents from that process. But what the kids do would be the same. That is, they would have to pay their taxes or pay less taxes if they had less ability to pay. There wouldn't be a change in that part of the process.
I've got another question, and that is, could emulated minds, you've written a whole book on EMS.
I did.
What they could do, right? Right. Could they experience cultural drift? Or would they be
Right, so EMS and AIs have
uniquely
this
human thing?
EMS and AIs have the same situation here with respect to cultural drift. That is, if you create brain emulations, and they would be Malthusian in the sense that they would face stronger survival pressures because it's easy to create a lot of them, and they would live near subsistence levels. But if we were afraid of EMS and wouldn't let M culture deviate from human culture, we made sure that whatever values and norms we had, we made sure the M's obeyed, then whatever drift we suffer, they will suffer too. It's only if their selection pressures can be applied to variation in cultures such that they're allowed to vary their cultures from each other and from us, then their existence would allow a fixed cultural drift. But again, that's at the cost that they could defy your concept of human rights. I mean, try to make this highlighted. You're in a world where you like the idea we have a world culture that agrees on human rights, because that means nobody in the world gets to violate human rights without strong pressure from the rest of the world stopping them, right? But that's what it is to share a culture.
So yes, Lev from the audience says taxes don't pay back debt. They reduce inflation. And he's also said that governments don't borrow money, governments determine money supply. And then he said later, people like the aesthetic diversity of cultures and are challenged by moral diversity because norms tend towards universalism, whereas aesthetics tend towards subjectivity. So, yeah, I just thought I might cover
So,
his
I mean, that
points
last comment, I think,
forward
just
one.
agreed with what I said. People are comfortable with diversity that doesn't matter in their view. But when diversity is about things that matter to them, they don't like diversity. And then I think that commenter just has some unusual opinion about the nature of government debt and taxes, which differs from the usual economist. I'm a professor of economics, so I'm going to go with the usual economist view about the nature of relationship between taxes and debt.
So Rosario said, so what I understand is a culture issue, therefore it is a matter of the world system values. I'm not sure how to formulate that into a question, but yeah, it's a comment.
It seems like he's agreeing with what I'm saying.
Okay. Jeremy, who also asked a question earlier, said that what about cyclical processes? People married younger at times and older at other times. Have there been baby booms and other times a reduction in population that sort of swings? I guess he's talking about a pendulum effect.
Right.
Do you think it will swing back to high fertility in
Well,
time to save innovation?
So In the long swing of civilization, we seem to see this pattern of the rise and fall of civilizations. I'm not the first person to mention this. It's a very common noticed pattern. And I think cultural drift is a plausible candidate explanation for part of why there is the rise and fall of civilizations. So that's a cycle. But what that cycle means for us is the rise and then fall of our civilization. Now, certainly within a civilization or within period, we have various cycles. So, for example, look, we have fashion cycles where, dresses get short, dresses get long, hair gets short, hair gets long, right? There's definitely fashion cycles that we've seen over time. In political systems, we swing to the left, swing to the right, swing to the left, swing to the right, right? The question is, to what extent will those cycles be enough to fix the long-term drift problem? It seemed like at best the cycle would temporarily reverse a problem until it went the other way. So, for example, there was a baby boom in Europe and the United States in the 30s and 40s, which then went away. So, I tend to look at long-term trends, but long-term trends are always going to be, added to short-term fluctuations. So the more short-term fluctuations you look at, the more there is to explain and the harder it is to explain. I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain every short-term fluctuations that there's ever been anywhere in history. I'm just going to say, well, look, there's this long-term trend, and that's the thing to keep your eye on and to worry about. And you might luckily get a short-term trend that temporarily relieves the problem of the long-term trend, but then you go back to the long-term trend.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about futurarchy and how that actually operates.
Happy to. So a simple example is...
Probably deserves a whole a talk, but
right,
elevate
but a very
it.
quick. So an example of futarchy would be firing the CEO of a for-profit company. The question is, should the CEO be fired? And at the moment, you have a board of directors whose job is to make that decision. And the board gets a certain, modest salary from the company, and they don't have strong incentives. And so they usually were put there by the president, and so they're pretty reluctant to fire the CEO, which, should be done cautiously, not too eagerly. It's a big, serious decision to make. But what I would suggest instead of the board is to make special called off stock markets. So if the company has a stock, an ordinary stock market trades the stock for cash. So the price might be 22 at the moment. And that means if you pay 22, say dollars, you get one stock. And when you trade in an ordinary stock market, you see a price and you should compare that price to what you think the company is worth. And how do you decide that? You think of all the situations the company could be in. And for each situation, you say, well, what's the company worth in that situation? Like, how much can it sell? How much profits can it make? How long can that last? And then you add those up across all the situations, weighting it by the probability of each situation to get an expected value for the company. And you compare that to the price of the company. And you buy if you think the price is too low, and you sell if you think the price is too high. Okay? Now, instead of an ordinary stock market, I'm going to add two called off stock market. So a called off market is a market where you make a trade, but the trade is undone as if it never happened if certain conditions aren't met. So we're going to have a market in the company stock if the CEO is still in power at the end of the quarter. We're going to have another market in the stock price of the stock if the CEO is not in power at the end of the quarter. And what that means is those will be called off if those events don't happen. So that means when you're thinking about the price of trading in this market, what you should think about is what are the scenarios the company could be involved in that are consistent with the CEO staying there? What are the other scenarios that are consistent with the CEO leaving? And then you would only look at those separate scenarios in calculating your price for the company that you want to trade, because the trade's going to be called off if that condition isn't met. So because the trade is conditional, you're going to focus on a conditional value for the company in thinking about the stock prices. And now we're going to get two conditional values for the company. The value of the company, the CEO stays, the value if they leave. And the difference in those two prices is exactly the speculators telling you whether it's worth keeping the CEO. So that's a very concrete example of how you can have a conditional market estimating an outcome like the stock price, conditional on a decision like keeping the CEO. And that's the key governance mechanism for futarchy. So futarchy is a mechanism by which we'd have a metric for a country, say, which was national welfare that had a bunch of numbers that went into it, like GDP. And we'd have an asset that pays out in terms of that national welfare. And then we'd let people trade that asset to guess what they think its value is. And then we'd have conditional markets. Every time there's a proposal for changing the government, like a bill before Congress in the world today, then you have a price for the asset of national welfare conditional on passing the bill, conditional on not passing the bill. You look at the price, different the prices. If the price from passing the bill is higher than the price from not passing the bill, that's speculators saying we think national welfare will be higher if you pass the bill. And so you just pass the bill when the market says it's higher. And that's a mechanism that recruits all the information available to market speculators. And we have many empirical studies that suggest that's a very powerful mechanism for aggregating information into accurate estimates on a wide range of topics.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we've got time for now. We're just about to start another panel. I'm going to give people a chance to have a little break, but it's really
that makes sense.
Great having you do a lovely talk here. I'm
Thank you
really
for inviting
looking forward to. Yeah, it's been great. And you've got you're
I will be on a
participating in
panel again in 4.5 hours.